All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling a text that I think throws a really fascinating curveball into the history of ideas. Right?
Oh, yeah?
The Theology of Aristotle. Like, come on, as a philosopher, you see that title, you immediately recognize the weight of that name. But
Buckle up.
yeah, prepare for a twist because this theology, it's not quite his handiwork.
Right.
So our mission today on this deep dive is to explore this intriguing work and trace its winding path through history, understanding not just its content, but the implications even of its existence and its attribution.
Well, and I think, to navigate this kind of complex intellectual terrain, we're going to be drawing on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on this text, right?
Yeah.
The Theology of Aristotle. And the SEP, as you know, is just kind of a gold standard in scholarship.
Yeah.
So it offers really just a rigorous and researched overview, perfect for our deep dive today.
Okay, so let's jump right into the philosophical puzzle at the heart of this.
Okay.
The Theology of Aristotle is a misnomer.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting for us, I think, as philosophers.
Okay.
In the 9th century, big chunks of Plotinus's Ennids-like foundational text of Neoplatonism, we all know, were translated into Arabic.
Yeah.
And are surprisingly credited to Aristotle.
Right.
What is the immediate philosophical significance of that misattribution?
Well, that's the crucial starting point, right? I mean, the sheer scale of this attribution, it wasn't like a couple lines we're talking about. I mean, significant portions of Plotinus ended up being received under this banner of Aristotle.
Yeah.
The preface to the Theology itself actually boldly declares it as the book of Aristotle, the philosopher called in Greek Theologia, that is, Discourse on Divinity.
Mm-hmm.
So even the title, it's propagating this kind of initial incorrect claim. But the philosophical weight, I think, here lies in how this kind of misattribution, it would have immediately shaped the reception of these Neoplatonic ideas. It would have framed them within this already established Aristotelian authority. So, yeah, it's a big deal. It's a huge deal.
I mean, yeah, that's huge. And it's not like some shadowy, anonymous process, right?
Right.
We know that Ibn Naima al-Himsi, a Syrian Christian scholar, super prominent in that 9th century Arabic intellectual scene, was the translator, and the philosopher al-Kindi, a huge name, corrected it for Ahmad ibn al-Mutasim. So this historical context is crucial, right, for understanding, what are the intellectual currents at play here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it places this text squarely within that vibrant kind of intellectual ferment of 9th century Arabic scholarship, a period just marked by this intense engagement with translation of these Greek philosophical and scientific works.
Yeah.
And I think what's particularly remarkable from our perspective as philosophers interested in the transmission of ideas is that, and this is crazy, the Greek text used for this Arabic translation, it actually seems to predate our oldest surviving Greek manuscripts of Plotinus's Ennids. So think about that for a second, right? A 9th century Arabic version potentially offering us a glimpse into an earlier textual state of a major philosophical work.
Right.
That raises huge questions about textual authority and the pathways of knowledge.
It does. The very idea that a translation might hold clues to an earlier form of a Greek text is that's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's the question of the translation itself. So was this a direct leap from the Greek into the Arabic? Or did it go through a Syriac intermediary? What are the philosophical implications of either scenario?
I mean, that's a critical, historical question. While Zimmerman, who's one of the scholars of this text, argued pretty strongly for a direct Greek translation, the fact that al-Himsi was a Syriac speaker has led some more recent scholars to kind of reconsider the possibility of this intermediary. Syriac, as you know, played a huge role in the transmission of Greek learning into the Arabic world. Philosophically, the difference matters because the Syriac intermediary, it could have introduced another layer of interpretation and adaptation even before it reached the Arabic readers, right? However, this direct Greek translation hypothesis, it still has considerable support among scholars.
Yeah, okay, now another key figure in Plotinus' story, his student Porphyry, right, who famously organize the Enneads,
Yeah.
is mentioned in the preface as providing an exposition.
Right.
So could this theology actually be a translation of like a lost commentary
Right.
or reworking
Right.
by Porphyry? I mean, that would add like another layer of interpretation before it even entered the Arabic intellectual sphere.
Right. I mean, it's a really intriguing hypothesis, one that scholars have explored. And while Zimmerman ultimately argued against the theology being like a full translation of some kind of Porphyrian commentary,
Okay.
the possibility isn't entirely dismissed. It's more likely that these mysterious headings at the beginning of the theology, they actually could derive from Porphyry's lost index of like main points in the Enneads.
Okay.
These headings, they display this deep familiarity with Plotinus's system, which of course would align with Porphyry's expertise in structuring and interpreting his teacher's work. So even if it's not a full commentary, this Porphyrian influence might still be subtly present, kind of shaping the way that Plotinus was initially framed for these Arabic readers.
So even with that direct attribution to Aristotle being wrong, like the path of this text, it's so layered with interpretations.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this misleading title, we've got this like complex web of origins, but the theology of Aristotle, it's not just passively transmitting Plotinus's ideas, it's actually engaging with them and reshaping them. Like, tell us about that.
It's true. The Arabic Plotinus is far from a kind of straightforward verbatim translation. It's more accurately characterized as a free paraphrase with these frequent interpolations.
Yeah.
And these aren't just, minor linguistic tweaks. I mean, they're introducing new philosophical concepts and shifting the emphasis on existing ones. Effectively, it's transforming into an interpretation of Plotinus, right?
Yeah.
One that is tailored for the intellectual currents of the time. So this active reworking, I think, it's a key insight for us in understanding the philosophical agenda behind this text.
You mentioned these interpolations.
Yes.
Can you give us like a concrete example of how these changes fundamentally alter Plotinus's original philosophical ideas?
Absolutely. So let's consider the very opening of Enneads v.2.
Yeah.
Right? The one is all things and no one of them.
Okay.
It's just this classic example of Plotinus, like paradoxical style, right? Emphasizing this utter transcendence and ineffability of this first principle. Now, contrast that with how the theology renders this in its 10th Maimar. It says, the pure one is the cause of all things, and is not like any of them. So, notice the significant introduction of cause here. While Plotinus certainly discusses emanation, this direct assertion of the one as a cause is distinct, and it's a more definitive statement.
Yeah.
And furthermore, the phrase is not like any of them. It softens, I think, the radical paradox of Plotinus's original formulation. This seemingly small change, it carries, I think, significant philosophical weight.
Yeah.
It's shifting the understanding of the one from this almost unimaginable unity to something more akin to, like a prime mover or first cause in a more traditional metaphysical sense.
Right. So it's moving this Neoplatonic one closer to a more theistic conception. Are there any other key instances where we see these philosophical reworkings at play?
Oh, absolutely. Take, for instance, the interpolation found at the conclusion of the very first Maimar.
Okay.
This passage engages directly with Plato's creation account in the Timaeus.
Right.
And here, the theology, it presents a defense of this non-literal, non-temporal interpretation of creation. And it argues that Plato only speaks about a beginning in time because of these inherent limitations of human language when you're trying to articulate this kind of causal priority.
Right.
This interpolation is significant because it reveals this active engagement with these philosophical debates about cosmology and the nature of time, debates that were very much alive in these intellectual circles in the 9th century.
Yeah.
It shows the translators and interpreters not just, transmitting, but actively participating in philosophical discourse.
Yeah, it really paints a picture of this dynamic environment where Greek philosophy isn't just received, but it's actively digested and reshaped within an Islamic context.
That's right.
This leads us to the core philosophical ideas within the theology itself.
Yes.
Let's begin with the conception of God, or the One. You already highlighted its presentation as like a creating God. How does that differ fundamentally from Plotinus's original conception, and what are like the philosophical implications of this divergence?
Well, the divergence here is quite profound. In the Arabic version, the one is consistently depicted as this kind of creating God, frequently accompanied by these epithets like originator, creator, right? And while Plotinus describes the emanation of all things from the one,
Right.
the emphasis on this deliberate act of creation, it's just considerably stronger in the Arabic text.
Oh, okay.
And then, furthermore, the theology often kind of blurs Plotinus's carefully established distinction between the one and nous, or intellect. So in the Arabic text, this first cause is often described as thinking or even being an intellect, a concept Plotinus himself approached with great caution, precisely to avoid anthropomorphizing this ultimate principle and limiting its absolute transcendence.
Right.
So, this blurring, I think, has significant implications for understanding the relationship between the ultimate reality and the realm of thought.
So there's a clear Aristotelianizing tendency at play here, like bringing the Neoplatonic one
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it.
closer to this concept of a self-thinking thought,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
How does this impact other Neoplatonic ideas, like the soul's return to the one?
Right. Well, this assimilation, it does affect these other key Neoplatonic concepts. So, for instance, this idea of the soul's return to the one, which in Plotinus is this kind of mystical ascent beyond the realm of intellect,
Yeah.
is often conflated in the Arabic Plotinus with a return to intellect.
Okay.
Again, I think it's reflecting this closer identification of the one with nous.
Okay.
And then we also see this explicit introduction of Aristotelian terminology.
Mm-hmm.
So the theology describes God as pure actuality,
Okay.
al-fil al-mad,
Okay.
which is directly borrowed from Aristotle's metaphysics, a concept laden with implications regarding potentiality and actuality in the divine.
Right. So that's a significant philosophical anchoring of the divine, right?
Yes.
Within this Aristotelian metaphysical framework.
Absolutely.
And you also mention this description of God as pure being.
Yeah.
What's the philosophical significance of that?
Right. So following the description of God as pure actuality, the theology further characterizes God as pure being, an ephakad.
Mm-hmm.
While the precise etymology and interpretation of ania has been subject to, some scholarly debate,
Right.
and the philosophical impact of this assertion, right?
Yeah.
The notion of God as the very essence of being, it's huge, it's substantial, it touches upon fundamental questions of ontology.
Yeah.
And it has even been praised as an influence on later thinkers, like Aquinas,
Wow.
highlighting the enduring legacy of this Arabic interpretation.
Okay, another fascinating point you raise is the discussion of divine attributes in the theology.
Yes.
And it sounds like there's a nuanced, perhaps even paradoxical approach being taken here. What's philosophically noteworthy about this?
Yeah, so the text presents what appear to be contradictory statements, right? At times denying attributes to God, emphasizing divine simplicity and transcendence,
Okay.
and at other times affirming them in the manner of a cause
Right.
or in a higher way. So, this delicate balancing act, I think it likely reflects these contemporary theological debates, within 9th century Islam concerning the nature of God's attributes. Philosophically, it also resonates with these traditions of negative theology or epiphatic theology,
Right.
which attempt to understand the divine by describing what it is not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's possible we're even seeing here this indirect engagement with thinkers like Pseudo-Dionysius in this nuanced discussion.
So this really underscores the intellectual ferment of the period, where these Greek philosophical ideas are being actively debated and integrated.
Yeah, it was a really dynamic period.
Within a new, religious and philosophical context.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's turn to this intriguing concept of an ignorance better than knowledge. That just sounds like a philosophical paradox ripe for unpacking.
Oh, it is, yeah. It's a particularly striking and, I think, original interpolation, found in the second Mimar. The text posits this ignorance higher than knowledge. And it actually delineates two distinct types of this superior ignorance.
Okay, lay it on me.
The first is the ignorance that a higher principle possesses, regarding what is below it. So the rationale here is that it's beneficial for the higher principle, so something like the soul or intellect, to remain ignorant of, the lower material realm.
Right.
And this helps them avoid being drawn away from the realm of the pure intelligibles.
Okay, so it's almost like a form of necessary detachment.
I think that's a great way of putting it, yeah.
Like a beneficial lack of awareness in order to maintain its, superior nature.
Precisely.
Okay, what about the second type?
Yeah, so the second type of this superior ignorance is the ignorance that a lower principle has of the higher one.
Okay.
And the theology illustrates this with this example of, the intellect being ignorant of the one. The argument presented is that if the intellect were to fully comprehend or have, complete knowledge, marifa, of the one. It would, in a sense, have to be causally prior to it, a notion the text deems, very repugnant.
Right.
Because it would undermine this absolute primacy of the one.
Mm-hmm.
So this paradoxical doctrine, it serves to kind of safeguard the utter transcendence and incomprehensibility of this first principle.
Right. So that's like a fascinatingly paradoxical way to assert this, like absolute transcendence of the one, right?
Yes.
It almost echoes some strands of like negative epistemology that suggests the divine can only be approached through like negation, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And you mentioned some potential influences on this idea.
Yeah, so while you can definitely discern echoes of Aristotelian ideas about knowledge being the grasp of causes, the particularly paradoxical articulation of this doctrine, it doesn't have a direct parallel in Aristotle. Some scholars have speculated about potential influences from Porphyry or even the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius, suggesting a complex interplay of intellectual currents that are contributing to, the unique philosophical landscape of this theology.
All right, moving on to psychology, like a core area of philosophical inquiry.
Right.
How is the concept of the soul treated in the Arabic Plotinus? And do we see similar Aristotelianizing tendencies at work there?
Yeah, we do. The soul receives, significant attention throughout these extant Arabic Plotinus materials. And what's interesting is the paraphrase remains remarkably faithful to Plotinus's concept of a world soul.
Okay.
A concept that, as tended to kind of fade from the cosmological frameworks of other Arabic philosophers at the time, including Al-Kindi himself. The theology, it maintains a clear distinction between this world, soul, and intellect, which, as we noted earlier, it offers further evidence against this hypothesis of a direct Porphyrian reworking, because Porphyry held different views on this matter.
But when we look at the individual soul, do we see a greater degree of Aristotelian influence, like in its conceptualization?
Yeah, absolutely. In the third Maimar, the world soul is presented as the first in this kind of hierarchy of four types of soul: universal, rational, bestial, and nutritive. So this fourfold division, it clearly mirrors Aristotle's hierarchical understanding of the soul, as outlined in his De Anima. And then furthermore, when the Arabic text encounters Plotinus's allusion to Plato's tripartite soul, reason, spirit, and appetite, it interprets this through the framework of Aristotle's three kinds of soul: reason, animal or sensitive, and vegetative or nutritive. So this consistent tendency to interpret Plotinian ideas through an Aristotelian lens is quite striking.
It really seems like the translators and interpreters were engaged in a project of philosophical harmonization, right? Like they were seeking to bridge or find common ground between these two towering figures of Greek thought.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned a specific instance where Aristotle's view of the soul as entelecheia is addressed.
Yes, the Arabic rendition of Ennius, the 54.7.85, found within the third chapter of the Theology, offers a particularly illuminating example of this harmonizing endeavor. So in the original Greek, Plotinus critiques Aristotle's definition of the soul as entelecheia, or the perfection of the body. Right. But the Arabic version adopts a completely different stance. It asserts that the most excellent philosophers, and is implying Aristotle here, correctly describe the soul as entelecheia.
Wow.
And then it proceeds to reconcile this viewpoint with Plotinus's own understanding.
And how do they propose to bridge this, like, seemingly fundamental difference in their conceptions of the soul? Like, what's their philosophical maneuver here?
The proposed reconciliation hinges on this idea that only the rational soul is, like, the true independent soul.
Okay.
But they argue that the soul is still the form of the body, aligning with Aristotle.
Okay.
But in the sense that it serves as the source of the body's form or perfection. So this is a clear attempt to synthesize the two positions, acknowledging the validity of both Aristotle's and Plotinus's perspective by offering a nuanced interpretation, that seeks to find common ground rather than highlight points of disagreement.
Right. So the theology of Aristotle, it's much more than a simple translation, right? And it's a fascinating philosophical project of like synthesis and reinterpretation and adaptation.
That's right.
And given these significant changes, right, and its attribution to such a weighty figure, it must have exerted considerable influence on subsequent Arabic thought.
Oh, it did, yeah. It's crucial for us to remember that it was this reworked version of Plotinus, not the original Greek, that played this pivotal role in shaping later Arabic intellectual history. And its influence was both widespread and enduring. For example, it is explicitly cited in The Harmony of the Two Sages, Plato and Aristotle, a work attributed to Al-Farabi as evidence supporting the compatibility of Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics on fundamental issues like the atemporal creation of the universe and the existence of Platonic forms. And interestingly, Al-Farabi seems to have regarded the Theology as a more comprehensive work, encompassing material that we now attribute to the Arabic Proclus.
Wow.
So this highlights its central role in these attempts to, synthesize these Greek philosophical schools.
Right. So it became like a cornerstone, right, in this ongoing philosophical endeavor within the Arabic tradition to reconcile these two towering figures of Greek thought. What other specific, intellectual lineages can we trace back to its influence?
Well, its impact was felt almost immediately, right?
Yeah.
So it served as a primary source for this Book of Causes, which was the Kindi Circle's adaptation of Proclus's Elements of Theology.
Okay.
It also appears to have significantly influenced the Arabic rendition of Aristotle's De Anima and the work of this 9th century Christian author, Qasta ibn Luqa.
Okay.
Particularly his arguments concerning the immateriality of the soul.
And did its influence persist beyond that initial period of translation and reception?
Absolutely. The 10th century witnessed this peak in its influence.
Okay.
Several Ismaili authors, they adapted Plotinus's hierarchical framework for their own Neoplatonizing metaphysics, even integrating it with elements drawn from Islamic theology. And thinkers of the caliber of Al-Amiri and Miskawayh were also either directly or indirectly shaped by this Arabic Plotinus. Miskawayh's shorter healing, for instance, is just replete with terminology and doctrines directly traceable to it. Even the Jewish philosopher Isaac Israeli drew upon the Arabic Plotinus in the 10th century.
Oh.
So it demonstrates its broad appeal across these different intellectual and religious traditions.
Right. It sounds like it became a foundational text for Neoplatonic thought within the Arabic-speaking world.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Transcending specific religious or philosophical schools of thought.
Absolutely. And the story continues, right?
Sure.
So a long version of the theology emerges, possibly within this Ismaili context, which further reworks the text and introduces, these novel philosophical ideas. This expanded version was even translated into Latin in the 16th century, thereby extending its reach into, the Western intellectual tradition.
Wow. So this thing, it really took off.
Yeah, it did. And remarkably, even Avicenna, despite his skepticism regarding its authenticity, as a genuine work by Aristotle, wrote commentaries on it, underscoring its enduring relevance in these subsequent philosophical periods. And even its influence persisted into the Safavid period in Iran, with these numerous manuscripts and commentaries being produced, demonstrating this lasting appeal within these philosophical circles.
So the theology of Aristotle, it stands as this powerful example of how philosophical ideas can travel across cultures and time, undergoing significant transformations and leaving a lasting impact on the course of intellectual history in often unexpected ways. It's a profound case study in the cross-cultural exchange of philosophical thought.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, the key takeaway for you, I think, as a philosopher, is that the theology of Aristotle, it provides this compelling illustration of how philosophical ideas are not just transmitted, they're actively interpreted, adapted, integrated within these new intellectual landscapes. It reveals how Plotinus was understood, how it was reshaped, and assimilated into this Arabic intellectual world, deeply, engaged with Aristotelian thought. And so this deliberate misattribution, the philosophical reinterpretations, the attempts at harmonization, all of these factors significantly shaped the subsequent reception and development of both Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism in the Arabic world and beyond.
It certainly prompts us to consider the very nature of philosophical authority, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the creative potential inherent in the process of translation and adaptation. I mean, how might the very act of attributing these Neoplatonic ideas to Aristotle have influenced their reception and integration within the Arabic intellectual tradition?
Yeah.
It's truly a thought-provoking question to continue pondering.
That's right.
Thank you for guiding us through this intricate and fascinating history today.
My pleasure. It's always a joy to dive into these kind of fascinating twists and turns in the history of philosophy, always offering new perspectives on these enduring questions.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.